This is Steffen Schmidt. I wanted to uh, share with you my sort of reflections on what happened when Hurricane Irene hit the United States in 2011, because it's a great example of what we uh, want to investigate and look at. It highlights numerous dimensions of what I'm interested in as a policy analyst and a political scientist, and what we're all interested in terms of our shared interest in coastal policy and coastal zone management. First of all, government and politicians are essentially learning organizations. They do evolve, they do learn from mistakes, and when the hurricane began to show signs of being a significant event, one of the things we were asking ourselves was, how are we going to respond to this compared with the response to Katrina, yeah, and the disaster along the Gulf and in New Orleans? And what we discovered was that at all levels of government, at the local level, at the state level, as well as at the federal level, there was a much greater preparedness, and the organizations all were forward placed. In other words, supplies, equipment, and personnel were in positions to respond to the hurricane, rather than waiting until it had actually hit and then moving in. So that was a, let's call it a refreshing discovery. Secondly, with any disasters, and especially coastal disasters, we tend to use the past as prologue to the future. In other words, we tend to look at the past and say what happened, and so this is what we need to do in the future. And so, having looked at Katrina and how that evolved, we expected a great deal of damage from Irene right on the coastal littoral, in other words, right on the coast, on the beaches, on waterfront. We expected a lot of storm surge and storm damage, and wind damage. And the news media, of course, prepositioned themselves and got themselves right into the middle of the storm. But you could tell as Irene hit that there wasn't really that much wind. There wasn't really that much going on, at least not for a long duration, in the places where we expected it to happen. What did happen was unexpected, and that is that the storm moved inland and upward into non-coastal states, in particular Vermont, and was a slow storm and an extremely wet storm, and so it began to dump enormous amounts of rainwater in those river basins and valleys and mountainous areas. And as you will recall, with Irene, suddenly you had flash floods. Suddenly you had swollen rivers ripping out bridges and roads and going downstream and essentially bringing damage from inland to places like New Jersey, rather than coming from the ocean and doing the damage that way. So while we were prepared, we were not really correctly prepared for the essentially the sort of altered effect of this particular storm compared to what we think hurricanes should be doing. After all of this disaster occurred, a second very interesting set of events began to happen, and that was, we're in the middle of congressional budget discussions. We have a big national deficit. We have a huge national debt. The Republicans have been very active, and the Tea Party in particular believe that government is too big, that we should be cutting government spending and government programs. And lo and behold, when the Obama administration put forward a jobs bill that would require the appropriation of some funds to stimulate the economy some more and to extend unemployment insurance and do some other things, the Republicans in the House decided that they were not going to vote for that. And they also decided that they were not going to vote for disaster relief and to fund the entire disaster relief operation that was already underway with FEMA, for example, with operations in places such as Iowa, where there had been some tremendous flooding, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, flooding of the Missouri River. Still relief efforts that were being continued, and funding for victims of tornadoes in several Midwestern states, in Missouri and other places. The Republicans decided that they were not going to fund any continued money for FEMA unless the Obama administration also cut an equivalent amount from the federal budget. And that produced then a whole series of very interesting back and forth discussions. Eventually, the Republicans saw that this would be a political disaster for them not to fund, to help people whose homes and businesses were destroyed, to help rebuild bridges and roads that had been wrecked in Iowa, which is not a coastal state, but which had some tremendous flooding, roads and some dikes and levees, and farm areas, farm fields needed rehabilitation after these terrible floods. And of course, all the way from Vermont down to the shore, there was a lot of damage still from Irene that needed to be fixed. And we heard things such as Ron Paul saying, well, the federal government really shouldn't pay disaster relief like that. People should know where they're taking chances. Others were saying, well, really this is the federal government's fault that we have these problems, because with flood insurance, people are taking chances and taking risks and building in places where they shouldn't be building. So, some of which may be true, but we saw a very interesting and lively discussion about whose responsibility disasters are. At the same time that the Republicans in particular and conservatives really deny the fact that there is climate change, in spite of the fact that the evidence is rock solid. Doesn't matter if it's human caused or not. Let's not even get into that argument. Of course, we know some of it is, a lot of it may be, but we know that there is some significant climate change underway already. We fear that stronger storms such as Irene may become more usual, that this won't be some sort of aberration and some weird emergency, but that in fact storms like that may become routine. They may happen more and more frequently. And that is denied by and simply ignored by a lot of the policymakers who are in Washington, D.C., and some of them who are running for office and running for president. And that's a very alarming thing, because even the U.S. military, and you either have read about it or will read about it, has a very important report, a very important document, in which the U.S. military basically is estimating what will be the consequences of climate change and global warming, not only domestically, where facilities along the shore, such as airports, power plants, Navy bases, Air Force bases, and other installations like that may be at risk if we have sea level rises and more violent storms. And secondly, that they are very worried that there will be droughts, there will be famine, there will be tremendous flooding around the world, and all of those things together produce a displacement of people who will become environmental refugees, essentially, create perhaps great political instability in some parts of the world. And I'm actually working with some climate scientists, writing a proposal for the Department of Defense to fund some research on where the critical areas in Southeast Asia, in this case, are where climate-related disasters may produce civil unrest and situations where the United States and the U.S. military may need to be ready to provide assistance, to provide food and water and evacuation and medical help and so on, in order to prevent climate change-induced unrest from becoming a threat to the national security of the U.S. If the U.S. military is concerned about that, and the U.S. military, by the way, is also concerned about an interruption in the supply chain of fuel, the U.S. military is the single largest consumer of oil and gasoline, diesel, and so on in the United States. In climate-related or violence-related interruptions of the supply chain, disturbances where there are oil wells offshore, disturbances, by that I mean climate disturbances, massive destruction of refining facilities, which are almost always located on shore, disruption of shipping, tankers may not be able to go if there are more violent storms, unloading may be difficult. Those are concerns of the U.S. military, and if that's the case, the U.S. military being a fairly skeptical and conservative outfit, the politicians that I mentioned earlier really should study what we now have as evidence, and when they look at disaster relief and they look at what they do in cases such as Hurricane Irene and other future coming coastal disasters, I imagine there will be some, they should have a policy response that is kinder and more realistic. Those are my comments on disasters and coastal zones. Thanks a lot.